The night was quiet, not in a poetic way, not in a way that demanded attention. It was simply there. A late December night in Northern California, where the cold stayed mild and the roads emptied early. A parked car rested at the edge of a dark turnout near Vallejo. Inside it were two young people, talking without urgency, unaware that the night around them was already changing. Nothing about the moment felt fragile. Nothing hinted that it would be remembered. When the headlights appeared, they did not rush. The car slowed, stopped briefly, then moved away. It felt ordinary, almost forgettable. Minutes later it returned. What followed was sudden, efficient, and quiet. Gunshots cut through the stillness, and then there was silence again. By the time the sun rose on December 21, 1968, the world continued as it always had. Newspapers were delivered. Stores opened. People went to work. Only a few police officers, standing beside a car riddled with bullets, understood that something unfamiliar had begun. At first, the case carried no weight beyond tragedy. A double shooting. Young victims. No suspect. No clear motive. The file joined many others like it, placed carefully into a system built to make sense of chaos. There was no reason, yet, to believe this crime belonged to a larger story. It was treated as a single, terrible moment that ended where it began. 6 months later, on the night of July 4, 1969, the illusion of isolation collapsed. Fireworks cracked across the sky as celebrations filled the streets of Vallejo. In another darkened area, another parked car sat quietly. Another couple, another moment that felt safe. The attacker arrived with the same calm presence. When it was over, one victim lived long enough to describe what had happened. The details connected instantly. Same method, same precision, same restraint. The realization came slowly and then all at once. This was not coincidence. This was repetition. The police began to understand they were no longer dealing with separate acts of violence. There was intention now. Planning. A person who returned to the same idea because it mattered to him. Still, there was hesitation. Patterns meant responsibility. Responsibility meant pressure. And pressure meant the possibility of failure played out in public. Then the letters arrived. They did not come with rage or urgency. They came with control. 3 newspapers received envelopes within days of each other. Inside were handwritten notes, measured in tone, confident in purpose. The writer described the murders in detail. Details that had never been released. Details only the killer could know. Along with the words were symbols and strange markings, carefully arranged. A cipher. The letters demanded publication. Not asked for it. Demanded it. The threat was clear. If the papers refused, more people would die. Editors argued behind closed doors. Police debated consequences. Eventually, fear won. The letters were printed. The cipher followed. And with it, the writer gave himself a name. Zodiac. It was not a nickname given by journalists or investigators. It was chosen deliberately. A name that suggested cycles, control, inevitability. A symbol followed soon after, a circle crossed by straight lines. Simple, stark, easy to remember. It appeared again and again, like a signature meant to outlive the hand that drew it. The letters continued. They were not frantic. They were not emotional. They were structured, sometimes almost courteous. The writer corrected mistakes in reporting, counted victims as if balancing numbers on a page, mocked the police with quiet confidence. He wanted attention, but not chaos. He wanted to be understood, even admired, on his own terms. The ciphers became public puzzles. Amateur cryptographers worked alongside professionals. Newspapers published attempts. Most failed. One message was eventually decoded by a schoolteacher and his wife, working at their dining table. What they found was unsettling, not because it revealed identity, but because it revealed mindset. The message spoke of killing without remorse, of people reduced to objects, of death treated as accumulation. There was no confession of guilt, no hint of self-awareness, just explanation. The murders escalated. At Lake Berryessa in daylight, the Zodiac approached 2 people by the water. This time he wore a hood. The symbol was drawn on his chest. He He spoke calmly, explained his intentions, tied his victims with care. Then he stabbed them. One survived. The killer walked away without hurry. Later, he wrote again, describing the attack in detail, including facts no outsider could know. The police received the letter after the blood had dried. Fear spread unevenly. It was not panic. It was tension. Parents watched their children more closely. Police increased patrols. Tips flooded in. None of it mattered. The Zodiac appeared when he chose and vanished just as easily. In one letter, he threatened school buses. In another, he complained about lack of media coverage. He sent greeting cards. He referenced films and music. His tone shifted, but his control remained. Suspects emerged, one after another. Each seemed possible for a moment. Each fell apart under examination. Handwriting did not match. Timelines failed. Evidence dissolved. The Zodiac remained untouched, existing only through his words and the harm he left behind. Then gradually the letters stopped. There was no final message, no explanation, no surrender, just absence. Years passed. Technology changed. Investigators revisited old evidence with new tools. DNA, digital analysis. Some ciphers were solved decades later. Others remained silent. Names continue to surface. Certainty never arrives. The Zodiac Killer did not become a person in the end. He became a space, a gap between facts, a reminder that some crimes resist resolution not because of complexity, but because of timing, chance, and human limitation. The victims remain real, their lives interrupted, their futures erased. The killer remains undefined. The letters still exist, stored carefully, paper aging, ink fading slowly. They say nothing new. They never did. And the story ends without clarity, without justice, without closure. Just as it began, with a night that felt ordinary and a silence that refused to explain itself. The investigation expanded outward, not forward. Files multiplied. Maps were pinned with colored markers. Timelines were redrawn again and again, each version confident for a few weeks before collapsing under its own assumptions. Detectives compared notes late into the night, circling the same facts, staring at the same gaps. Every confirmed detail seemed to create two new uncertainties. Witness descriptions were close, but never close enough. A man seen walking away. A figure crossing a street. Average height. Average build. Glasses maybe. Hair color uncertain. Every detail felt usable until it was tested, and every test weakened it. The Zodiac seemed to exist only at the edge of clarity, always just outside the frame. The letters kept arriving, but not on a schedule anyone could predict. Sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months. Each one reminded investigators that the person writing them was still present, still watching the reaction. He commented on police statements, on newspaper editorials, on the public's fear. It was clear he followed coverage closely, adjusting his tone when he felt ignored, softening it when he felt satisfied. In one letter, he mocked a police sketch, dismissing it casually. In another, he referenced the failure of roadblocks meant to capture him after a murder in San Francisco. He described routes, timing, small decisions that made escape possible. He never explained why he chose those places, those people. Only that he did. The San Francisco killing shifted everything. It happened in the city, not a remote area. A cab driver working a late shift picked up a passenger. The ride was short. The destination ordinary. The murder was brutal but quick. This time, the Zodiac did not disappear entirely. Witnesses saw a man wipe down the cab, walk away. Police arrived within minutes. A mistake in communication allowed him to slip past officers who had briefly encountered him without realizing who they were speaking to. That detail haunted the department for years. The Zodiac wrote about it later, with visible satisfaction. He described the error precisely, turning a procedural failure into personal triumph. The tone was not excited. It was measured, as if confirming a theory already proven. After that, the letters grew stranger. Less focused on murder, more focused on control. He sent a piece of a victim's shirt as proof. He demanded attention, using increasingly theatrical language. At times, the confidence slipped into irritation. He complained about placement in the papers, about how he was portrayed, about how his intelligence was underestimated. The murders, however, did not continue at the same pace. Time passed without new confirmed attacks. Some believed he had been arrested for something else. Others believed he had died. Some thought he had simply stopped, satisfied with what he had already achieved. The uncertainty became part of the case itself. Without a final act, the story refused to settle. Suspects accumulated in layers. One was questioned intensely, drawing national attention. His habits aligned. His interests overlapped. His history raised concerns. Yet nothing held. Another suspect emerged years later, backed by circumstantial connections and personal accounts. Again, nothing definitive. Each theory created communities of belief, arguments built on interpretation rather than proof. Meanwhile, the victims remained unchanged in the narrative. Names spoken quietly, photographs fixed in time, lives reduced to moments surrounding their deaths. Their families aged. Some passed away without answers. The case continued to move forward without moving anywhere. Decades later, new methods reopened old evidence. DNA testing offered a possibility that had never existed before. Partial profiles were developed. Exclusions were made. Hope surfaced briefly, then retreated. The material was too degraded, too incomplete, too uncertain to speak clearly. One cipher, unsolved for over 50 years, was finally decoded. The message inside was disappointing in its emptiness. No name, no confession, just more words designed to circle around meaning without landing on it. The Zodiac, even decades later, refused to clarify himself. The letters, when read together, do not tell a story of rage or ideology. They tell a story of attention, of control exercised through absence as much as presence, of a person who understood systems well enough to exploit them, but not well enough to leave nothing behind. And still, no ending arrives. The files remain open. The boxes remain labeled. The symbol remains recognizable. The name still carries weight, not because of what is known, but because of what never was. The Zodiac Killer exists in fragments, in handwriting, in police radio transcripts, in aging paper and fading ink. He exists in the space between certainty and doubt, between noise and silence. And that silence, stretched across decades, continues to hold its ground. As years passed, the case stopped behaving like an investigation and began behaving like an archive. New detectives inherited old boxes. They read reports written by men who had already retired, or died, or quietly moved on to other failures. Each generation approached the material with the same confidence at first, believing distance would reveal what proximity could not. And each generation reached the same conclusion in different words. There was not enough. There was never enough. The surviving witnesses aged into different people. Memory softened. Sharp edges blurred. Descriptions that once felt precise now carried hesitation. Details were revised unconsciously, influenced by years of retelling, by documentaries, by sketches seen too often. Human memory, once relied upon as evidence, became something investigators learned to handle carefully, almost apologetically. The Zodiac letters, however, did not age in the same way. They remained fixed. Each stroke of ink preserved exactly as it was laid down. Analysts studied spacing, pressure, rhythm. Linguists examined word choice. Psychologists read tone shifts like weather patterns. Some believed the writer was educated. Others believed he was mimicking intelligence. Some saw confidence. Others saw insecurity masked as control. The same pages supported opposing conclusions with equal strength. One detail stood out across time. The Zodiac did not rush. His crimes were brief, but his communication was patient. He waited between letters. Let fear cool. Let attention drift. Then returned not to escalate violence, but to reassert presence. The silence was not absence. It was strategy. In police departments, the case became something younger officers were warned about. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was consuming. It invited obsession. It rewarded certainty and punished it equally. Detectives learned to guard themselves against attachment to a single suspect. The case had destroyed careers quietly, not through scandal, but through fixation. Public interest never fully faded. It ebbed and flowed, resurfacing with books, films, anniversaries. Each revival promised resolution. Each ended with the same unanswered space. The Zodiac adapted to time without changing. He remained modern without existing. Some believed he had been closer than anyone realized, that he had spoken to police, walked past them, that he had sat in rooms where his name was mentioned without reaction. Others believed he was ordinary to the point of invisibility, a man who blended because he did not stand out, someone no one remembered clearly enough to miss. The contradictions never resolved. He was careful yet left evidence, intelligent yet careless, public yet hidden, violent yet restrained. Every attempt to define him produced a version that broke under its own weight. In the absence of conclusion, theories multiplied. They filled the space left behind. Some were grounded, others were elaborate. All shared the same flaw. They required belief where proof did not exist. The Zodiac resisted belief. He existed only as documentation. Even the confirmed facts felt unstable when held too long. Victim counts changed. Attributions were questioned. Lines between confirmed and possible blurred. What remained solid were moments. A car door opening, a letter being sorted at a newsroom desk, a police radio call misunderstood by seconds. Time did not soften the unease. It preserved it. There was no transformation of the story into legend or myth. The Zodiac never became distant enough for comfort. His presence remained practical, procedural, unfinished. He was not a ghost. He was a file that never closed. Somewhere the last letter was placed into storage. No announcement marked the end. No declaration. Just the quiet realization that nothing more was coming. Not because it was solved, but because the voice had chosen silence. Whether that silence came from death, distraction, or satisfaction was never answered. The system was left holding the weight of uncertainty alone. The story did not conclude. It thinned out, like sound traveling too far to return. By the late 1970s, the Zodiac case had settled into an uncomfortable rhythm. Not active enough to demand constant urgency, not resolved enough to be forgotten. It lived in filing cabinets and quiet conversations. Detectives no longer expected a phone call or a fresh letter, but they also never assumed the story was over. The possibility lingered that the person responsible was still alive, still ordinary, still unseen. Some investigators began to believe the Zodiac's greatest advantage had never been intelligence or planning, but timing. He operated during a period when communication between departments was slow, records were fragmented, and forensic science was limited. Small errors compounded. A missed description here, a delayed broadcast there. Each mistake insignificant on its own, irreversible when combined. The case was shaped as much by what failed to happen as by what did. The psychological profile evolved over time. Early assessments focused on compulsion and control. Later interpretations shifted toward performance. The letters were not simply communication, they were regulation. The Zodiac adjusted public emotion the way others adjusted volume. When fear peaked, he withdrew. When attention waned, he resurfaced. Violence was not constant because it did not need to be. The threat was enough. There was also the question of audience. The Zodiac did not write for the police alone. He wrote for editors, for readers, for anyone who would take the time to decode him. The crimes created fear, but the letters created participation. People waited for them, discussed them, tried to solve them. In doing so, they unknowingly extended the reach of the person behind them. As the decades progressed, the case became a study in limitation. Not just of technology, but of certainty. Investigators learned that even when facts are accurate, they may still be incomplete. Even when conclusions are logical, they may still be wrong. The Zodiac case offered no single failure to correct. It offered only accumulation. Families of the victims lived with two parallel realities. One in which their loss was final and personal. Another in which it was endlessly public and unresolved. The names of their loved ones appeared again and again, tied forever to a man who never acknowledged them as individuals. Time did not loosen that connection. It tightened it. New detectives approached the case with restraint learned from history. They avoided bold declarations, avoided narrowing too quickly. They reviewed everything, knowing most of it would lead nowhere. Progress, when it happened at all, came quietly. An exclusion, a clarification, a small certainty gained without celebration. The Zodiac himself remained absent. No late-life confession, no deathbed statement, no hidden archive discovered. If he watched the renewed interest, he did so silently. If he had planned a final reveal, it never arrived. Eventually, the case stopped being about capture. It became about records, about preserving what was known without pretending it was enough. The story was no longer waiting for an ending. It was learning to exist without one. In that space, the Zodiac remains exactly as he left himself. Not fully seen, not fully gone, defined not by answers, but by the refusal to provide them. The letters sit unchanged. The evidence remains finite. The silence endures. And the quiet that followed was not relief. It was simply the absence of sound, where a voice once insisted on being heard. By the time the case entered the 1980s, it had outlived the era that created it. The cultural noise that once amplified every letter had faded. Newspapers no longer waited for envelopes with nervous anticipation. Television had moved on to newer horrors, faster stories, clearer villains. The Zodiac did not adapt to this shift. He did not chase relevance. He allowed himself to recede. Inside police departments, the file remained active in name only. Detectives were assigned, then reassigned. Each new officer began the same way, with discipline and distance, promising not to fall into the traps that had consumed others. They reviewed the letters first, then the crime scenes, then the suspects. The pattern repeated, not because of incompetence, but because the material demanded it. There was no other way to approach it. One detail grew more troubling with time. The Zodiac had never been sloppy enough to reveal himself completely, but he had never been careful enough to disappear entirely. The balance suggested something deliberate. Not a mastermind beyond error, but someone who understood just enough about systems to exploit their weaknesses. Someone who relied on probability more than perfection. That realization changed how some investigators viewed the silence. It was no longer assumed to be accidental. It began to look intentional. The Zodiac did not stop because he was caught. He stopped because continuing no longer served his purpose. The letters had accomplished what the violence could not. They had created permanence. As forensic science advanced, the case briefly resurfaced. DNA offered a promise that felt different from all previous hopes. Samples were tested. Profiles were built from partial traces. Suspects were excluded with quiet efficiency. Each exclusion narrowed nothing. It only confirmed that the answer, if it existed at all, lay elsewhere. The public response to these developments was restrained. There were no celebrations, no dramatic headlines. People had learned what the Zodiac case did to certainty. Every claim was met with caution. Every announcement carried an unspoken question that never needed to be asked. The letters themselves became objects of study rather than threats. They were analyzed for rhythm, structure, and control. Linguists noted repetition. Psychologists noted restraint. The Zodiac never dissolved into chaos, even when his tone shifted. There was always a sense of calibration, of someone adjusting pressure without losing grip. One theory suggested that the Zodiac was not driven by compulsion, but by authorship. That the crimes were events, but the letters were the work. That the killings were necessary only to legitimize the voice. Once the voice was established, the violence became optional. The silence that followed was not regret or fear. It was completion. Years passed without interruption. The case aged quietly. Detectives retired. Evidence was digitized. Reports were condensed. What once filled rooms was reduced to data. Yet even in compression, the uncertainty remained intact. Nothing essential was lost, because nothing essential had ever been found. The Zodiac did not leave behind a body of work that could be interpreted. He left behind fragments that resisted assembly. Every attempt to arrange them into a narrative revealed more gaps than structure. The story refused to hold. In the end, the Zodiac became a measure of absence, a reminder that some crimes do not resolve because they were never designed to. They were designed to persist, to exist as unfinished business inside systems that depend on resolution. The silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied, and in that occupation, the case remains. Not active, not closed, simply present. By the 1990s, the Zodiac case existed in a strange middle state. It was no longer current, yet it refused to become historical. It surfaced periodically, not because something new had been discovered, but because nothing definitive ever had been. Each reappearance carried the same tension, the same restraint, the same quiet disappointment when certainty once again failed to arrive. Some detectives began to speak about the case differently, not as an unsolved crime, but as an unsolvable one. Not because the truth did not exist, but because it had passed through a window that no longer aligned with the tools available to capture it. The moment had closed. The world had moved forward without taking the answer with it. The surviving documents became fragile. Paper yellowed. Ink thinned. Evidence bags were handled with increasing caution, not just for forensic integrity, but because they had become irreplaceable artifacts of an unfinished narrative. Every item carried weight beyond its material value. A stamp, a fingerprint too partial to match, a phrase repeated too often to be accidental, yet too common to be unique. The psychology of the Zodiac continued to attract attention, though never consensus. Some saw a man deeply invested in superiority, needing to correct others to maintain control. Others saw insecurity masked by structure, an identity built entirely on reaction. Each interpretation drew strength from the same letters, the same silences, the same contradictions. The material supported everything and confirmed nothing. One aspect grew clearer with distance. The Zodiac never escalated emotionally. There was no visible breakdown, no frantic surge, no final burst of rage. His disappearance lacked drama because his presence had never depended on it. The crimes were not the point. They were the entry. As time passed, the victims' families faced a choice that no one prepares for, whether to continue hoping or to live without resolution. Some spoke publicly, some withdrew, some accepted that the absence of answers was itself the final condition. Justice in the traditional sense became secondary to memory. Law enforcement maintained the case officially, but the language shifted. Phrases became careful. Expectations were managed downward. The possibility of a living suspect faded into improbability. Still, the file remained open, not because closure was expected, but because closing it would imply something that could not be proven. The Zodiac did not age in the public imagination. He did not become weaker or smaller or less capable. He remained fixed at the moment he disappeared, forever middle-aged, forever undefined, forever just out of reach. That permanence made him resistant to time in a way few criminals ever are. Occasionally, a new name surfaced. A former acquaintance, a distant relative, a man whose habits seemed to align just enough to provoke suspicion. Each claim followed the same arc. Attention, examination, collapse. The pattern repeated so often that it became predictable. The case absorbed these attempts without changing. What remained undeniable was the structure of control. The Zodiac chose when to act, when to speak, when to stop. He shaped the rhythm of the investigation without ever revealing himself. Even in silence, his influence persisted. The absence became part of the design. There was no moment when the case ended. No announcement. No closing statement. It simply continued not happening. Year after year. Decade after decade. The quiet stretched forward, uninterrupted. And within that quiet, the Zodiac remained exactly where he had left himself. Not in hiding. Not in pursuit. Just unresolved. As the calendar moved into the early 2000s, the Zodiac case acquired a new kind of attention. Not urgency. Not fear. Curiosity shaped by distance. People who had not been alive during the murders encountered the story without context, without the weight of lived anxiety. For them, the Zodiac was not a threat. He was a question. This shift altered how the case was handled. Investigators became historians as much as detectives. They reconstructed environments that no longer existed, police procedures that had changed, communication systems that had been replaced. Decisions that once seemed reasonable now appeared flawed under modern standards. Yet judgment remained restrained. The case had unfolded within its time, and that time no longer existed. Digital archives replaced physical ones. Reports were scanned, letters photographed, audio recordings preserved. The case became searchable, sortable, reducible to data points. But reduction did not bring clarity. If anything, it made the absence more visible. When everything was laid out side by side, the gap stood out sharply. The missing connections, the paths that ended without explanation. New interest produced new interpretations. Some focused on geography, mapping movements and distances with modern precision. Others focused on language, running letters through software to detect patterns no human eye could reliably see. These efforts produced findings, but not conclusions. Probabilities without anchors. Correlations without confirmation. One uncomfortable realization surfaced repeatedly. The Zodiac had benefited from anonymity not because he was extraordinary, but because he was unremarkable. There was no extreme behavior outside the crimes, no trail of instability, no dramatic personal collapse. If he existed in daily life as he appeared in his letters, he did so quietly, blending into routines that offered no reason to look closer. The absence of a final act remained one of the most unsettling aspects. There was no escalation toward exposure, no slip caused by urgency or age. The Zodiac did not overreach. He did not test limits. He simply withdrew. That restraint contradicted many assumptions about serial offenders. It suggested intention rather than impulse, control rather than compulsion. For law enforcement, this reframed the silence. It was no longer viewed as a mystery to be solved, but as a decision made long ago. The Zodiac had ended his participation in the story. The system had been left to carry the remainder alone. Occasionally, an envelope from decades earlier would be re-examined. A stamp, a postmark, a trace once dismissed as irrelevant. Each review carried the same hope that something overlooked might finally speak. Most remained quiet. Some offered exclusions. None offered names. The cultural presence of the Zodiac hardened into shape. He became a symbol of incompletion, a reminder that not every narrative aligns with resolution, that some stories end not with answers, but with limits. The fascination persisted not because of spectacle, but because of restraint, because the case refused to explain itself. Time continued forward without resistance. Detectives who once worked the case firsthand passed away. Their notes became secondary sources. Their memories became references rather than evidence. The story slipped further from lived experience and deeper into record, and yet it never fully detached. The Zodiac remained anchored by specificity. Dates, places, words written by a hand that once existed. He could not be dismissed as myth because too much of him was real, and he could not be resolved because too much of him was missing. The investigation did not fail in a single moment. It failed gradually through accumulation, through the slow recognition that no decisive point remained ahead. Only review, only preservation. The silence endured, not as an ending, but as a condition that refused to change. As the years moved deeper into the 21st century, the Zodiac case began to feel less like an investigation and more like a fixed point in time. It did not age the way other crimes did. It did not soften or lose detail. Instead, it stayed rigid, preserved by its own incompleteness. Every new generation encountered it in the same state the last had left it. Law enforcement agencies adjusted their expectations quietly. There was no announcement that the case had reached its limits, no official acknowledgement that resolution was unlikely. The language simply changed. Words like when were replaced by if. The emphasis shifted from solving to documenting, from pursuit to accuracy. The remaining evidence was treated with a kind of reverence, not because it promised answers, but because it represented the boundary of what could be known. Every envelope, every fragment, Every transcript was handled with care, not out of optimism, but out of respect for the weight it carried. These were not just clues. They were remnants. Psychological analysis continued, though it no longer aimed at identification. It aimed at understanding shape rather than source. The Zodiac was viewed as a construct built through action and communication. A personality revealed only in fragments. A person who chose expression over explanation. Who left impressions rather than confessions. One aspect remained consistent across interpretations. The Zodiac never attempted to justify himself. He did not claim injustice. He did not describe a grievance. His writings lacked narrative about his own life. There was no story of origin, no appeal to sympathy. He existed only in the present tense of his actions. That absence of personal context made him resistant to profiling. There was nothing to trace backward. The crimes themselves, when revisited, appeared almost minimal in execution. No excessive force. No prolonged engagement, no indulgence in chaos. The violence was instrumental, not expressive. It served a function and then ended. That restraint unsettled analysts more than brutality ever could. It suggested discipline, selectivity. The public continued to return to the case, not out of fear, but out of unease. The Zodiac represented a failure of narrative closure, a story that refused to resolve into meaning. People searched for answers not because they expected them, but because the absence felt unnatural. Stories were supposed to end. This one did not. Over time, even speculation grew quieter. The more the case was examined, the clearer its limits became. There were no hidden layers waiting to be uncovered. No dramatic reversal approaching. What existed had already been seen. What remained unseen had likely passed beyond reach. The letters were still read, not for clues but for tone, for what they revealed about control, timing, and intent. The words had not changed. Their impact had. They no longer threatened. They lingered, like an echo that had lost its source. The Zodiac did not become smaller with age. He did not fade into irrelevance. He occupied a narrow space, fixed and permanent, too specific to ignore. Too incomplete to resolve. His power lay not in action, but in restraint, in knowing when to stop. There was no moment when certainty replaced doubt, no final confirmation. The case remained open, because closing it would imply an answer that did not exist. Silence in this context was not empty. It was accurate. And so the story continued without movement, not progressing, not ending, simply remaining. A quiet record of what happened, and of what never did. As attention drifted further from the original events, something subtle changed in how the Zodiac case was spoken about. The urgency that once surrounded it was replaced by a careful neutrality. Investigators, writers, and archivists no longer approached it expecting revelation. They approached it expecting resistance. The case had taught them that it did not yield easily, and that forcing it to do so only produced distortion. The evidence remained finite. No matter how many times it was revisited, it did not grow. There were no new letters authenticated beyond those already known. No additional crimes conclusively tied to the same hand. The boundaries of the case were fixed, and within those boundaries, everything had already been examined. What remained was interpretation, and interpretation had limits. Some analysts focused on the gaps themselves, on what the Zodiac did not say. He never explained his choice of victims. He never expressed anticipation or regret. He never acknowledged aging, fatigue, or fear. His voice, when it existed, was static. It did not evolve the way a real life often does. That consistency suggested something deliberate. Either the letters were carefully constructed to maintain a specific image, or the person writing them saw no need to adapt. There was also the question of disappearance. People vanish for many reasons. Death, illness, imprisonment, change of circumstance. But the Zodiac vanished without disruption. There was no stumble, no interruption in tone. One letter did not trail off. One threat did not go unfulfilled. The communication simply ceased, cleanly, as if the end had already been decided. This absence became its own kind of presence. It influenced how the case was remembered. The Zodiac was no longer defined by what he did, but by what he refused to provide. No resolution, no closure, no satisfaction for those who sought understanding. The story remained open not because it was active, but because it was incomplete. The victims' names continued to be spoken, quietly and consistently. They did not fade in the same way speculation did. Their lives, interrupted abruptly, became the only fixed points in a shifting narrative. Everything else moved around them. Theories, profiles, timelines, none of it altered the fact of their absence. Law enforcement maintained the case with a kind of professional humility. There was no illusion of certainty, only the acknowledgement that some investigations end not with answers, but with boundaries. The Zodiac case marked one such boundary. It showed where process met limitation, where effort met time. Public fascination persisted, but it changed in tone. The excitement drained away, leaving behind a more subdued unease. People were no longer searching for a reveal. They were confronting the idea that none was coming, that the story as it existed was all there would ever be. The Zodiac did not become symbolic of evil or chaos in the abstract. He became symbolic of absence, of the space left behind when explanation fails to arrive, of the discomfort that remains when a question outlives the moment in which it could have been answered. Nothing in the case pointed forward anymore. All direction was backward. Review, preservation, careful handling of what little remained. The work continued, but without expectation, without anticipation, only responsibility. And in that restrained, unresolved state, the case endured, not moving toward an ending, not collapsing into forgetfulness, simply holding its place, a record of events that happened, and of answers that never followed. With each passing decade, the Zodiac case became less about the man and more about the void he left behind. Investigators who reviewed the material in later years often remarked on how little emotion the file carried, not because the crimes lacked brutality, but because the language surrounding them had been stripped down by repetition. Everything dramatic had already been exhausted. What remained was precision. The letters were read again, not to decode them, but to understand their posture. The writer never pleaded, never rushed, never reacted impulsively. Even when he appeared irritated, the irritation was controlled, measured, almost rehearsed. This suggested a person who valued composure more than release, someone for whom expression was not cathartic but functional. There was also the matter of scale. The Zodiac never attempted to expand his reach beyond a narrow geography. He did not seek national chaos. He did not chase mass casualties. His threats implied reach, but his actions remained limited. This contradiction unsettled analysts. It suggested that the illusion of power mattered more than its execution, that being perceived as capable was enough. As forensic methods continued to improve, the question shifted again. Not whether the Zodiac could be identified, but whether identification would mean anything if it came too late. Many of the people connected to the case were already gone. Witnesses, investigators, family members, even a confirmed name would arrive into a world that no longer resembled the one in which the crimes occurred. That realization introduced restraint. The goal was no longer triumph. It was accuracy, avoiding false certainty, avoiding the temptation to close the story simply to satisfy discomfort. The Zodiac case resisted that impulse. It demanded patience, even in failure. Occasionally, a new analysis would suggest a fresh direction, a linguistic pattern, a geographic anomaly, a behavioral overlap with another crime. These leads were followed carefully, methodically. Most dissolved under scrutiny. A few narrowed possibilities without revealing truth. The case absorbed these efforts without changing its shape. What remained constant was the structure of silence. The Zodiac did not haunt through repetition. He haunted through stillness, through the knowledge that something unresolved continued to exist without explanation. That person could insert himself so precisely into history and then remove himself just as completely. The letters, when read aloud, sounded almost administrative. Lists, corrections, instructions. There was no narrative arc, no emotional progression, just presence, then absence. That abrupt shift made the silence louder than anything written before it. For those tasked with preserving the case, the work became one of balance, keeping it alive without inflating it, respecting the victims without feeding speculation, maintaining openness without promising answers. It was a discipline learned slowly, shaped by decades of restraint. The Zodiac did not become a lesson. He became a reminder that not every question is answered, that not every story resolves, that some events remain suspended in time, unchanged by attention or effort. The case did not fade because it was unsolved. Many cases remain unsolved. It endured because it ended itself. The person responsible chose when to stop speaking, and in doing so, controlled the final shape of the story. There was no final page, no concluding document, just an accumulation of what was known, carefully arranged, and left intact. And in that careful preservation, the case remains. Not active, not closed. Still, by the time the case reached what might be called its modern phase, it had become insulated from surprise. Every new development was met with calm analysis rather than expectation. The story had taught those who followed it not to anticipate resolution. Hope had been replaced by discipline. Curiosity remained, but it was tempered by experience. The remaining letters were treated less as communications and more as fixed artifacts. Their significance no longer lay in what they might reveal, but in what they represented. A moment when language itself became a weapon, when words extended the reach of violence without repeating it. The Zodiac understood that. He understood that fear did not require repetition. It required memories. That memory settled unevenly. Some details became sharp, others faded. Certain phrases were quoted endlessly. Others were forgotten entirely. The case developed an internal hierarchy of importance that did not always align with reality. What was emphasized often reflected discomfort rather than relevance. What was ignored often resisted interpretation. One of the most enduring questions was not who the Zodiac was, but why he stopped. Theories multiplied, none dominant. Death was possible. Incarceration for another crime was possible. Change of circumstance was possible. Satisfaction was possible. None could be confirmed. The silence offered no clues. It remained complete. That completeness was unusual. Most serial offenders deteriorate. They escalate. They fragment. The Zodiac did not. His disappearance did not resemble collapse. It resembled conclusion. Not an ending shared with others, but one chosen privately. Investigators eventually accepted that the final decision in the case did not belong to them. It belonged to the person who had withdrawn. The system could respond, document, preserve, but it could not compel an answer that had never been offered. This shifted the ethical center of the case. Attention moved away from speculation about identity and toward fidelity to fact, avoiding exaggeration, avoiding narrative temptation, allowing uncertainty to remain visible rather than smoothing it over. The Zodiac case became an exercise in restraint. The victims' lives, when revisited, offered contrast. They were not abstract. They were specific. Ordinary choices, ordinary nights, small decisions that placed them in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their stories did not need interpretation. They needed remembrance. Everything else remained provisional. The public continued to return to the case, often searching for closure that history had not provided. What they encountered instead was limitation, the recognition that some stories do not resolve because resolution was never within reach. The discomfort of that recognition lingered. The Zodiac did not linger as a personality. He lingered as a structure, a set of actions, a pattern of communication, a silence that followed. His presence was defined not by continuation, but by absence, not by explanation, but by refusal. No final document exists that ties everything together. No overlooked piece waiting to be found. The case does not move toward an answer. It holds the events. It holds the gaps. It holds the quiet that followed. And in that quiet, unchanged by decades of attention, the story remains exactly as it was left, unfinished, As the distance between the present and the original crimes continued to widen, the Zodiac case settled into a form that no longer invited interruption. It was not dormant. It was inert. Everything that could react to it already had. What remained was observation. Those who studied the case closely noticed how little excess there was. No dramatic phone calls after the murders. No manifesto. No attempt to frame the killings as part of a larger cause. The Zodiac did not ask to be understood. He asked to be seen. And once he believed that had been achieved, he withdrew without explanation. This absence complicated every effort to define him. Without continuation, there was no arc. Without escalation, there was no collapse. Without confession, there was no contradiction to resolve. The case remained suspended at the exact point where it lost momentum, frozen there by choice rather than force. In reviewing the letters, analysts often remarked on their economy. The Zodiac did not waste space. He wrote what he needed to write, then stopped. Even his threats were bounded. They were not open-ended. They implied control rather than chaos. He did not promise destruction without limit. He promised presence. That distinction mattered. The crimes themselves, when stripped of mythology, revealed no hunger for spectacle. There were no attempts to stage scenes, no effort to leave elaborate symbols beyond what was needed for recognition. The violence was purposeful, not expressive. Once its function was fulfilled, it ended. That restraint unsettled more than excess ever could. The case offered no insight into the Zodiac's private life. No workplace, no relationships, no moments of instability that could be traced. If he experienced doubt, fear, or regret, it never surfaced. His recorded existence was narrow by design. He appeared only where he intended to. This narrowed existence made him difficult to place in time. He did not age on record. He did not change style in ways that suggested progression. The Zodiac who wrote the first letter and the one who wrote the last appeared identical. That sameness reinforced the sense that what was being observed was not a life, but a role. Over time, the role outlived the person behind it. The Zodiac became a reference point rather than an individual. A case used to illustrate uncertainty. A name invoked to mark the limits of investigation. He existed more as a concept than a man, not because of exaggeration, but because of absence. Law enforcement continued to maintain the file, but without urgency. Not because the case no longer mattered, but because urgency had nothing to act upon. There were no incoming signals, no new communications, no movement to respond to. The system waited without expectation. In that waiting, the case took on a quiet gravity. It did not demand attention. It resisted it. Anyone approaching it was forced to slow down, to accept that progress would be measured not in breakthroughs, but in restraint. That there would be no reveal waiting at the end of review. The Zodiac had constructed a narrative that ended on his terms. Not with explanation, not with dominance, but with silence. A silence that did not invite interpretation. It simply existed. And within that silence, the case remains fixed. Not advancing, not retreating. Preserved exactly as it was left. By the time the case crossed the threshold into half a century of distance, it had become clear that time was no longer an active force within it. It did not erode the facts. It did not sharpen them either. It simply passed. The Zodiac case existed independently of chronology, unchanged by anniversaries or renewed attention. Each year added length to the silence, not weight to the answers. Those responsible for maintaining the records understood this instinctively. They no longer searched for momentum. They searched for accuracy. Each document was reviewed with care, not to uncover revelation, but to ensure fidelity. Errors, even minor ones, were corrected quietly. Not because they would lead to a suspect, but because the truth, however incomplete, deserved precision. The case files revealed something uncomfortable about the nature of investigation itself. They showed how systems are designed to resolve, to conclude, to close, and how poorly those systems adapt when resolution never arrives. The Zodiac case did not break the system. It exposed its limits. It revealed what happens when a narrative refuses to align with procedure. The letters, when revisited after decades, felt less threatening than they once had. Not because they lost meaning, but because their context had changed. The fear they once generated had been replaced by analysis. Their power now lay in restraint, in how little they offered while still commanding attention, in how they refused to fill the space they occupied. It became increasingly difficult to separate the man from the method. The Zodiac did not leave behind a personal story. He left behind a process. Crimes followed by communication. Silence followed by reappearance. Control maintained through unpredictability. When the process stopped, so did the presence. There was nothing underneath to examine. This raised an unsettling possibility, that the Zodiac did not vanish because something happened to him, but because nothing else was required. The objective had been achieved. Not the murders themselves, but the insertion of a voice into public space. Once that voice had been established, sustained attention no longer depended on repetition. The silence became sufficient. That silence grew heavier with time. Not dramatic, not oppressive, just persistent. It shaped how the case was taught, discussed, remembered. New investigators learned about it not as a challenge to be solved, but as a condition to be respected. They were taught caution, to avoid certainty, to recognize when restraint was the only honest response. The families of the victims lived alongside this restraint. For them, the passage of time did not clarify anything. It only made the absence permanent. The idea of answers became abstract, distant. Some chose to disengage. Others remained present, participating in remembrance without expectation. The case did not move with them. It stayed where it had always been. Public discussion occasionally flared with renewed confidence. A book promised resolution. A documentary suggested finality. Each time the same pattern emerged. Claims were examined. Evidence was weighed. Conclusions failed to hold. The Zodiac absorbed these attempts without change. The case returned to stillness. What endured was not fascination, but unease. The Zodiac did not frighten because of what he might do. He unsettled because of what he had already done and how cleanly he had stepped away. There was no struggle for closure because closure had never been offered. There was only the record. The record itself became the final form of the story. Not a narrative with an arc, but a collection of moments preserved without interpretation. A night in Vallejo, a letter arriving at a newsroom, a symbol drawn with care, a silence that followed. Each existed independently, without resolution tying them together. The case demonstrated something rarely acknowledged, that not all harm resolves into understanding, that some actions leave behind only consequences, not explanations, that the desire for meaning does not guarantee its arrival. As the years continued forward, untouched by new development, the Zodiac case remained fixed in its posture. Open but inactive, known but unresolved, present but silent. It did not ask to be remembered. It did not ask to be solved. It simply remained. As the distance from the original events continued to expand, the Zodiac case reached a point where even speculation began to thin. Not because curiosity disappeared, but because repetition had worn down the appetite for certainty. The same facts had been examined from every angle. The same contradictions had resisted resolution. What remained was acceptance without satisfaction. Those who revisited the case professionally understood this shift. They no longer approached it with the expectation of discovery. They approached it with care. The work became custodial rather than investigative, preserving integrity, preventing distortion, making sure the record stayed as close to reality as it could, even if reality itself was incomplete. The letters, when read in sequence, revealed something that had always been present but rarely acknowledged. The Zodiac never sought to control the future. He controlled the moment. Each communication existed only to influence what followed immediately. The fear, the coverage, the reaction. He did not build toward legacy. He built toward presence. And once presence was secured, continuation became unnecessary. This understanding reframed the silence. It was not a failure of communication. It was the final expression of it. The Zodiac had demonstrated that withdrawal could be as powerful as action. That absence could maintain control just as effectively as violence. That nothing more needed to be said. The The crimes themselves resisted reinterpretation. There were no hidden patterns waiting to be uncovered, no symbolic logic beneath the surface. The victims were not chosen to tell a story. They were chosen because they were available, because the conditions aligned, because the moment allowed it. Any attempt to impose deeper meaning only highlighted the lack of it. This absence of meaning unsettled people more than motive ever could. There was no grievance to debate, no ideology to dissect, no cause to confront. The Zodiac did not justify himself because he did not need to. The record existed without explanation, and that was enough. Over time, even the language used to describe the case became cautious. Words like legend and mystery were avoided. They implied drama where none existed. What remained was a case study in limitation, in the boundaries of knowledge, in the reality that some questions outlive the moment in which they can be answered. The victims' names continued to anchor the story. They did not drift. They did not change. They remained fixed points around which everything else rotated. Their presence reminded anyone engaging with the case that this was not an abstract puzzle. It was a record of interrupted lives. Everything else was secondary. Law enforcement agencies maintained the file not out of expectation, but out of responsibility. Closing it would imply certainty. Leaving it open acknowledged truth. The truth that the case had reached a state beyond resolution. That the final act had already occurred and it had been silence. The Zodiac did not fade into history the way other figures did. He did not become distant or symbolic. He remained immediate, not because of new action, but because of unfinished space. The gap he left behind never closed. It simply widened with time. Every attempt to fill that gap failed for the same reason. There was nothing inside it to retrieve. The absence was complete, intact, uncompromised by speculation. And so the case continued in its final form, not moving forward, not unraveling, simply holding its shape. A record of violence followed by unresolved quiet. A voice that spoke briefly, and then chose not to return. As the record extended further into the present, the Zodiac case reached a state that few investigations ever do. It no longer existed in anticipation of discovery. It existed as a boundary, a clear line marking where effort had ended and uncertainty had begun. Anyone who crossed into it understood, almost immediately, that there would be no reward for persistence, only familiarity. Those responsible for safeguarding the case learned to treat it carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it was easily misused. Overstatement had damaged it before. Assumptions had narrowed it. Certainty had been claimed too early and withdrawn too late. The lesson remained intact. Precision mattered more than confidence. The remaining materials were not dramatic. They were ordinaries. Typed reports, handwritten notes, photographs that showed more context than content. The power of the case had never come from spectacle. It had come from restraint, from how little was shown, from how much was withheld. The Zodiac's communications, when stripped of myth, revealed a deliberate minimalism. He never over-explained. He never filled silence for comfort. He understood that leaving space invited others to do the work for him. To speculate, to imagine, to continue the story on his behalf. That understanding required patience. It required trust in absence. Over time, that absence became the defining feature. The case was no longer remembered for its violence alone. Many crimes involved violence. It was remembered for how cleanly it ended itself, how completely it stepped away, how no loose end ever pulled the story forward again. There were moments when renewed attention almost changed this. A test re-examined, a letter reassessed, a claim brought forward with confidence. Each time the same outcome followed. Interest rose, analysis deepened, certainty dissolved. The case returned to its prior state unchanged. The pattern became familiar enough to predict. This repetition did not breed indifference. It bred caution. Those who engaged with the case learned to move slowly, to resist narrative momentum, to accept that sometimes the most accurate representation of truth is an unfinished one. The Zodiac did not leave behind an identity to to confront. He left behind a condition, one in which harm existed without explanation, in which fear existed without continuation, in which silence existed without reassurance. That condition could not be resolved because it was not created by accident. It was created by design. As time passed, the emotional register of the case flattened. Shock faded. Horror settled. What remained was discomfort, a low, persistent awareness that something had happened and had not been accounted for, that the system had reached its limit and stopped. The victims remained unchanged within this space. Their names, their photographs, their final moments stayed fixed. They did not evolve into symbols. They remained individuals whose lives had been interrupted without reason. That fact resisted abstraction. It grounded the case in reality long after speculation lost its footing. Eventually, even the act of revisiting the case became a gesture rather than an effort, a way of acknowledging that the unanswered still existed, that not everything submitted to process emerged clarified, that some stories retain their shape precisely because they refuse to conclude. The Zodiac did not defeat the system. He did not outsmart it in some grand, final sense. He simply stepped away at the moment when stepping away guaranteed permanence. He left nothing to chase, nothing to interrupt, nothing to resolve. And so the case remains where it has always been since the last letter was received. Not suspended in anticipation, not awaiting discovery, simply present. A closed circle without a center, a narrative without an ending, a silence that is never broken. As the case continued to exist without movement, something else became apparent to those who studied it carefully. The Zodiac did not simply evade identification. He altered the way absence itself functioned within an investigation. Normally, silence suggests failure, loss of trail, or oversight. Here, silence was complete. It was intact. It carried intention even decades later. Every attempt to revisit the timeline led back to the same immovable points. The crimes occurred. The letters arrived. The symbol appeared. Then nothing. The gap was not uneven. It did not taper or fragment. It was uniform. That uniformity resisted reinterpretation. It suggested not interruption, but conclusion. The case offered no emotional release, even with time. There was no catharsis in distance, no softening of impact. The unresolved nature of the story prevented transformation. It could not become history in the traditional sense because history implies outcome. This case offered none. Those who worked closest to it began to describe it differently in private, not as a mystery but as a limit, a reminder that not all events are metabolized by systems designed to explain them. Some remain external, unprocessed, not because they are too complex, but because they refuse cooperation. The Zodiac's actions, viewed through this lens, appeared almost economical. He used only what was required: violence to establish reality, communication to extend presence, silence to preserve it. There was no excess, no need to dominate through repetition. He did not seek escalation because escalation would have introduced risk. Stopping was the safest act he ever committed. This reframed the final years of attention. The absence of further communication was not puzzling. It was consistent. The Zodiac had always acted with restraint. Silence was simply restraint extended indefinitely. In the cultural record, the case began to occupy a quieter space. It was no longer framed as a riddle to be solved, but as an example to be acknowledged. It appeared in discussions about uncertainty, about the limits of forensic confidence, about the difference between knowing and proving. It taught without instructing. The material itself did not change. The letters remained what they were. The evidence remained finite. The victims remained central. What changed was the posture of those who encountered it. They no longer leaned forward, expecting revelation. They stood back, recognizing boundaries. The Zodiac did not leave behind a myth, because myths invite reinterpretation. He left behind documentation, and documentation does not bend easily. It records. It does not resolve. It preserves questions rather than answering them. At some point, even the idea of an ending became inappropriate. Endings imply direction. This story had none after a certain point. It did not move toward resolution or collapse. It simply stopped adding material. What existed was all there would ever be. The silence did not grow louder. It did not demand attention. It simply remained unchanged, unaffected by time or interest. It did not weaken. It did not decay. It stayed exactly as it was when it began. And within that sustained quiet, the Zodiac case continues to exist. Not as an open wound, not as an unfinished task, but as a fixed absence, a space where answers should be, and are not. As the decades accumulated, the Zodiac case reached a condition that few stories ever do. It stopped asking to be revisited. It did not resist attention, but it no longer responded to it. Every review ended where it began, with the same facts, the same silences, the same unresolved distance between action and explanation. Those who maintained the case learned to work within that distance. They stopped searching for momentum and focused instead on containment, ensuring that nothing false entered the record, that nothing speculative replaced what little certainty existed. The task was no longer to solve, but to protect the integrity of what remained. The letters continued to be the most intact element of the case, not because they explained anything, but because they demonstrated intent with unusual clarity. The Zodiac was precise in what he offered and equally precise in what he withheld. He never drifted into confession, never wandered into autobiography. He did not narrate his own life. He curated an image and then stopped. This restraint complicated every attempt at profiling. Traditional frameworks rely on progression, on change over time, on emotional leakage. None of that existed here. The Zodiac's recorded behavior did not deteriorate or escalate. It simply ceased. That absence of trajectory made the case resistant to interpretation. The crimes themselves, when examined without the weight of mythology, revealed nothing extraordinary in execution. There was no theatrical staging, no prolonged engagement, no attempt to maximize suffering. The violence was sufficient, then finished. That efficiency suggested a person who did not act impulsively, someone who valued control over expression. This understanding altered how silence was interpreted. It was no longer seen as a failure or interruption. It was consistent with everything that came before it. The Zodiac did not disappear because something went wrong. He disappeared because nothing required him to remain. The public, over time, adjusted to this reality. Interest did not vanish, but it softened. The case was no longer framed as an impending revelation. It became a reference point, an example used to illustrate the limits of investigation, the difference between curiosity and certainty, the discomfort of incomplete knowledge. For the families of the victims, the passage of time did not provide clarity. It provided distance. Distance from expectation. Distance from hope. Some found peace in that distance. Others carried the absence forward unchanged. The case did not resolve around them. It remained fixed. Law enforcement agencies continued to maintain the file, though its posture had changed. There were no task forces assembled, no deadlines set. The work became archival, periodic review, preservation, acknowledgement, the understanding that some cases are not solved, but managed. The Zodiac did not linger as a threat. He lingered as a question that refused to close, not because the answer was hidden particularly well, but because it had slipped beyond reach before anyone realized it mattered. The window had closed quietly. There was no final development waiting in the margins, no overlooked letter that would suddenly explain everything. The case had been examined too thoroughly for that. What existed had already been found. What was missing had likely never been recorded. The silence that followed the last confirmed communication did not invite interpretation. It did not hint. It did not tease. It simply existed. Unbroken, consistent, complete. And in that completeness, the Zodiac case found its final shape. Not a story with an ending, not a mystery awaiting solution, but a fixed record of what occurred and of what never arrived. As time continued to pass without interruption, the Zodiac case settled into something almost architectural. It had structure. It had boundaries. It had weight, but it no longer had motion. Anyone who entered it understood, quickly and instinctively, that they were not stepping into an unfolding story. They were stepping into a preserved space. The facts no longer rearranged themselves. Dates stayed fixed. Locations stayed fixed. The sequence did not change. What changed was only the distance between those facts and the present moment. And that distance did not clarify anything. It only emphasized how decisively the moment for resolution had passed. Those who studied the case in later years noticed how little room it left for emotion. The material itself discouraged reaction. There were no dramatic confessions to dissect, no sudden reversals to debate, just a series of events followed by deliberate quiet. The case demanded restraint from anyone who approached it. Excess interpretation felt immediately dishonest. The Zodiac's control over timing became clearer with age. He did not linger. He did not test the limits of attention endlessly. He entered public consciousness, established his presence, and then withdrew before overexposure could weaken it. That withdrawal preserved the image more effectively than continued action ever could have. The absence of a final message was not an omission. It was consistent with everything else. A final message would have closed the circle. It would have explained. It would have surrendered something. Silence surrendered nothing. Investigators eventually recognized that the case did not lack a solution because of missing effort. It lacked a solution because the conditions that would have allowed one no longer existed. Time had moved forward. Evidence had aged. Memory had softened. Context had dissolved. The case had crossed a threshold beyond which certainty could not follow. This recognition did not end the work. It changed its nature. The work became careful, slow, almost ceremonial. A commitment to preserving what was known without pretending it was enough. A refusal to invent closure where none existed. The Zodiac did not become larger than life. He became narrower, defined only by what he did and what he refused to do. There was no growth beyond that. No evolution. No reinterpretation that held. He remained fixed because there was nowhere else for him to go. Public fascination continued in a subdued form. It no longer sought revelation. It sought understanding of limitation. The case became a reference point for uncertainty itself, a reminder that not all stories obey narrative rules, that not every question is answered simply because it is asked often enough. The victims' presence within the record remained unchanged. Their names did not lose clarity. Their lives did not blur into abstraction. They anchored the story in reality, preventing it from drifting into theory or myth. Everything else remained provisional. The Zodiac case did not conclude. It stabilized. It reached a point where nothing new entered and nothing old left. The balance held. The silence did not deepen. It did not recede. It stayed exactly as it was. And in that stillness, the case remains. Not waitings, not unfinished, simply unmoving. As the case settled further into its unmoving state, it began to function less like an unresolved question and more like a permanent fixture. It occupied space in records, in memory, in institutional awareness, without demanding resolution. It was not waiting for something to happen. It had accepted that nothing would. Those who encountered the case late in their careers often described a similar reaction. An initial sense of curiosity, then restraint, then an understanding that the work would not lead outward. It would lead inward toward discipline, toward resisting the urge to complete a narrative that refused completion. The Zodiac's actions did not invite reinterpretation because they had already been reduced to their essentials. There were no hidden layers left to peel away, no overlooked motive waiting to be uncovered. The crimes existed. The letters existed. The silence existed. Together, they formed a closed system. Everything inside it had already been accounted for. This realization stripped the case of spectacle. It no longer felt dramatic. It felt factual, heavy but stable. The absence of resolution did not feel temporary. It felt structural, built into the case from the moment the final communication ended. The Zodiac's disappearance remained one of the most misunderstood elements. It was often described as mysterious, but mystery implies uncertainty about cause. Here, the cause was visible. The Zodiac stopped because stopping preserved control. Continuing would have introduced variables. Exposure, error, aging. Silence eliminated all of them. In that sense, the final act was not violence. It was withdrawal. A withdrawal executed with the same restraint that had characterized everything else. No announcement, no explanation, no trace of hesitation, just an ending without closure. The system left behind adjusted to that ending slowly. It took years for expectations to fade, years for the case to be spoken about without anticipation. Eventually, it reached equilibrium. The case was no longer framed as something that might change. It was framed as something that had reached its final form. That final form did not satisfy. It endured. The Zodiac did not become a subject of fear for new generations. He became a subject of unease, a reminder that some individuals intersect with systems briefly, disrupt them, and then leave nothing behind that allows correction. That some harm cannot be undone or even fully understood. The letters, preserved and reread, continued to resist familiarity. They did not soften with repetition. They did not grow clearer. They remained exactly as they were when first received. That permanence gave them weight long after their immediate impact had faded. The victim's absence remained the only constant consequence. Everything else shifted around it. Procedures evolved. Technologies advanced. Institutions changed. The loss did not. It stayed fixed, unaffected by progress or reinterpretation. At some point, even the language used to describe the case became minimal. Words were chosen carefully. Claims were avoided. Certainty was treated with suspicion. The case demanded humility from anyone who engaged with it. It punished overconfidence quietly by refusing to respond. The Zodiac did not leave behind a lesson. He left behind a condition, one in which questions outnumber answers, and where the desire for resolution must coexist with its impossibility. That condition remained stable because it was never resolved. The story did not end. It settled, and in that settlement, the case continues to exist, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a record that refuses to change. As the case continued to persist without change, it became clear that its endurance was not accidental. It had reached a state where nothing could be added without distorting what already existed. Any attempt to push beyond the known facts only weakened them. The silence surrounding the Zodiac was not empty. It was intact, preserved by time rather than eroded by it. Those who revisited the case in later years often found themselves confronting the same realization, that the work was no longer about discovery. It was about restraint, about knowing when not to assert meaning where none could be proven. The Zodiac case punished interpretation. It rewarded patience. It demanded acceptance of uncertainty without offering comfort in return. The letters remained the most complete expression of the person behind the crimes, and yet they revealed nothing personal. No background, no history, no vulnerabilities. The Zodiac never allowed his private self to enter the record. What existed was a constructed voice, maintained consistently until it was no longer needed. When that voice disappeared, nothing replaced it. This absence of personal trace complicated every attempt to humanize him. He could not be placed within a social context. He could not be located within a personal narrative. He existed only at the moments he chose to appear. Outside of those moments, there was nothing to analyze. No progression, no decline, no visible consequence. Over time, the case became an example cited quietly within investigative circles, not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a boundary to be respected. It demonstrated the point at which process meets limitation, where diligence meets time, where truth exists without resolution. The public's relationship to the case continued to evolve. Interest remained, but it was no longer driven by expectation. It was driven by discomfort. The discomfort of knowing that some stories do not resolve simply because they matter. That attention does not guarantee answers. That silence, once established, can be permanent. The Zodiac's control over his narrative extended beyond his actions. By refusing to conclude the story, he ensured that others would attempt to do it for him. Those attempts failed not because they lacked effort, but because they lacked material. The absence he left behind was complete. The victim's presence within the record did not diminish. Their lives, their final moments, remained sharply defined. They were not consumed by the mystery. They stood apart from it. The absence of resolution did not erase them. It framed them. As the years continued forward, untouched by new evidence or revelation, the Zodiac case remained exactly where it had been left. Not drifting, not decaying, simply unmoving. There was no final turn waiting to arrive. No overlooked detail poised to transform everything. The case had been examined too thoroughly for that. What was known was known. What was missing was gone. The silence that followed the last confirmed communication did not invite closure. It resisted it. It existed without explanation, without apology, without change. And within that silence, the case continues to stand. Not as an unanswered question, but as a record of limits. As the record moved closer to its present form, the Zodiac case no longer appeared unfinished in the traditional sense. It appeared complete in its incompleteness. Everything that would ever define it had already happened. Everything that followed was repetition without change. The absence of new material did not weaken the case. It clarified it. Each year without development confirmed that the silence was not temporary. It was structural. The Zodiac had exited at a point where re-entry was unnecessary. He had left behind enough to ensure permanence without risk. That calculation, once understood, removed any lingering expectation of return. Those who continued to work with the case learned to recognize this pattern. They no longer asked what might be missing. They asked what had been intentionally withheld. The distinction mattered. The Zodiac did not fail to provide answers. He declined to. And that refusal shaped the entire aftermath. The letters, viewed collectively, revealed a consistent posture. Control was never surrendered. Not emotionally, not intellectually, not narratively. Even irritation was measured. Even threat was bounded. The Zodiac did not seek dominance through chaos. He sought it through precision. Once that precision had established his presence, there was nothing more to gain from continuation. This understanding altered how the case was remembered. It was no longer framed as an investigation that stalled. It was framed as one that reached the edge of what was possible and stopped. The responsibility of those who followed was not to push beyond that edge, but to acknowledge it honestly. The crimes themselves did not invite reinterpretation with time. They did not become symbolic. They remained literal. People were attacked. People were killed. The violence did not evolve into metaphor. It stayed grounded, resisting abstraction. That groundedness prevented the case from drifting into mythology, despite its unresolved nature. The Zodiac's disappearance did not create suspense. It created stillness. A stillness that settled gradually and then held. There was no sense of anticipation left in it. No waitings, only presence. The case existed as a thing already formed, not as a process still unfolding. For those who encountered the story late, this was often the most unsettling aspect. Not the violence, not the letters, but the realization that nothing else was coming. That the story did not owe them an ending. That curiosity could exist without satisfaction. The institutions involved adjusted accordingly. The case was maintained with care, but without urgency. There were no deadlines attached to it, no expectations of resolution. It remained open because it could not be closed honestly. Closing it would imply certainty where none existed. The Zodiac did not leave behind a puzzle meant to be solved. He left behind a condition meant to persist, a space where explanation failed to arrive. That persistence became the defining feature. It outlasted theories. It outlasted technology. It outlasted those who had originally chased answers. As the record approached its current length, the shape of the story became unmistakable. It was not moving toward resolution. It was settling into permanence. The silence was no longer an absence of sound. It was the final state of the narrative. The case did not diminish with time. It clarified itself. What could be known had been known for decades. What could not be known had been removed from reach. The balance between those two states remained stable. And in that stability, the Zodiac case found its enduring form, not as a mystery awaiting solution, not as a story awaiting an ending, but as a fixed record of events that occurred, and a silence that followed by design. As the case moved closer to the shape it would likely hold forever, one final shift became noticeable. The desire to extract meaning from it weakened, not disappeared but quieted. People no longer leaned into the record expecting revelation. They approached it with recognition that the story had already said everything it was going to say. The Zodiac had not built a narrative meant to be followed to its conclusion. He had constructed an interruption, a break in expectation, a demonstration of how easily order could be entered and exited without explanation. That demonstration did not require continuation. It required only proofs. Once proof existed, repetition would have reduced its effect. This understanding reframed the entire sequence. The murders were not steps towards something larger. The letters were not chapters. They were confirmations. Each one reinforced the same point. That presence could be asserted briefly and then withdrawn without consequence. That institutions could be engaged and then abandoned. That attention could be summoned and then denied. The system responded as it always does, with diligence, with analysis, with effort. It traced what could be traced. It documented what could be documented. And when the trail ended, it did not collapse. It adjusted. It learned to hold an unanswered space without filling it artificially. This adjustment was not immediate. It took years, decades. Expectations had to be unlearned. The idea that every crime leads to resolution had to be set aside. The Zodiac case did not accommodate that belief. It contradicted it quietly, persistently, without ever arguing against it directly. The silence that followed the final communication did not invite interpretation because it did not change. It did not waver. It did not break under scrutiny. Time passed through it without leaving a mark. That consistency made speculation unnecessary. The absence spoke for itself. Those who returned to the case after long intervals often described the same sensation. Not fear, not curiosity, but a kind of stillness, as if the story had already reached equilibrium and would resist any attempt to disturb it. The material felt complete, not because it answered questions, but because it no longer pointed anywhere. The Zodiac did not become smaller as the years passed. He did not recede into obscurity. He remained proportionate to the space he occupied, defined only by what was recorded, unexpanded by theory, unsoftened by time. His presence was contained, and that containment preserved it. The victims remained the only elements that did not change in tone or weight. Their lives, cut short without reason, remained the fixed truth beneath everything else. No amount of analysis altered that fact. No passage of time reduced it. The absence of justice did not replace the reality of loss. It existed alongside it. The case did not ask for remembrance. It did not request interpretation. It did not invite closure. It simply existed as it had been left. Open, inactive, unresolved, not as a failure but as a condition. At a certain point, even the act of revisiting the case became an acknowledgement rather than an investigation. An acknowledgement that some events remain suspended not because they are hidden, but because they were never meant to return. That the final act had already occurred, and it was silence. Nothing followed that silence. Nothing interrupted it. Nothing ever arrived to replace it. And so the story rests where it has rested for decades, not moving toward an answer, not drifting into forgetfulness, just present. As the case approached the length of its own memory, another truth became unavoidable. The Zodiac did not leave behind confusion. He left behind clarity without completion. The facts were not tangled. They were simply insufficient, and no amount of revisiting them could manufacture what had never been recorded. This distinction mattered. Confusion invites correction. Insufficiency does not. It sets a boundary. It marks the place where inquiry must stop not because curiosity ends, but because honesty demands it. The Zodiac case crossed that boundary quietly, without announcement, sometime after the last verified communication. Everything after that moment was response, not action. The institutions that held the case learned to live with that boundary. Not comfortably, but correctly. They learned that preserving uncertainty was sometimes more truthful than resolving it prematurely. That restraint could be a form of accuracy. That silence, when authentic, did not need interpretation. The Zodiac's voice, when it existed, had been intentional in its limits. He never attempted to explain himself. He never invited understanding. He never asked to be forgiven or condemned. He asserted existence, then withdrew. That withdrawal was not defensive. It was decisive. In retrospect, this made the case unusually resistant to reinterpretation. There was no emotional arc to reframe, no confession to re-examine, no contradiction to exploit. The record did not evolve because it had never been built to evolve. It was static from the moment it ended. Those who encountered the case later often expected a revelation hidden in detail, a pattern overlooked, a connection missed. What they found instead was consistency, the same restraint, the same economy, the same refusal to provide narrative comfort. The case did not reward persistence with answers. It rewarded it with familiarity. The silence did not decay into ambiguity. It remained exact. No new voice ever emerged to claim the name. No final letter surfaced to reinterpret the past. The absence stayed complete. That completeness gave it weight. It did not suggest loss. It suggested conclusion without explanation. The Zodiac did not need to disappear dramatically to remain present. His absence did that work for him. By leaving nothing behind that could be corrected or challenged, he ensured that the story could never progress beyond a certain point. It would circle. It would review. It would stop. The victims remained the only elements untouched by abstraction. Their lives were not theoretical. Their deaths were not symbolic. They were real events, fixed in time, resistant to reinterpretation. Everything else existed around that reality, not above it. The public gradually absorbed this posture. The case was no longer treated as a puzzle waiting to be solved. It was treated as a reference, an example of how some narratives end not with answers, but with limits. How silence can be final without being explanatory. The Zodiac did not leave behind chaos. He left behind order that could not be completed, a structure missing its final piece by design. That design ensured endurance, not through repetition, but through restraint. Nothing new entered the record. Nothing old left it. The case reached a steady state, and in that state it remains. As the story moved toward the point where nothing further could be added without repeating itself, the case revealed its final quality. It did not feel abandoned. It felt concluded in a way that resisted satisfaction. Everything that defined it was already present. Everything that was absent had been absent for so long that its absence had become part of the structure. The Zodiac did not vanish into uncertainty. He exited into it. That distinction mattered. Uncertainty usually invites resolution. This uncertainty had settled. It no longer shifted under pressure. It did not respond to attention. It existed as a fixed condition, immune to reinterpretation. The record showed no sign of collapse. There was no final unraveling, no emotional spill, no moment where the voice cracked or contradicted itself. The last confirmed communications ended with the same restraint that had defined the first. The Zodiac did not leave behind fragments of himself. He left behind a boundary. Those who returned to the case in its later years often described a sense of quiet recognition. Not disappointment, not frustration, just an understanding that the story had already reached its natural limit. That the work left to be done was not discovery, but acknowledgement. The materials remained unchanged. The letters still read the same. The reports still described the same events. The timelines still ended where they always had. No reinterpretation altered their shape. The case resisted narrative motion because it had none left. In this final state, the Zodiac was no longer perceived as a figure moving through time. He existed only within the narrow span of his actions. Before them, there was nothing recorded. After them, there was silence. He did not age. He did not evolve. He remained contained within that brief intersection with history. The victim's presence remained the clearest truth in the record. Their lives were not abstract. Their absence was not theoretical. It existed without explanation, without resolution, and without relief. That reality anchored the case, preventing it from drifting into speculation or myth. The system that held the case did not fail. It reached its limit. That limit was not technological or procedural. It was temporal. The moment when the answer could have been captured passed unnoticed. By the time its absence was understood, it could not be retrieved. There was no final revelation waiting in obscurity. No overlooked confession. No hidden key. The record had been examined too thoroughly for that. What remained was honesty. The honesty of acknowledging that some stories end without permission. The Zodiac did not leave behind a riddle meant to be solved. He left behind a silence meant to remain. That silence did not weaken with time. It stabilized. It became the final state of the story. Nothing followed it. Nothing interrupted it. And so the case rests where it has rested for decades. Not moving forward. Not dissolving. A fixed record of events that occurred. And a silence that followed, complete and unchanged. As the narrative reached its outer edge, the Zodiac case no longer behaved like a story being told. It behaved like a fact being held. There was nothing left to arrange, nothing left to interpret without repeating what had already been said. The material resisted movement. It remained where it had been placed by the last confirmed action, unchanged by the years that followed. The finality of that placement was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply became apparent over time. Every attempt to advance the narrative returned to the same point. The same letters. The same crimes. The same silence. The repetition itself became proof. There was nowhere else to go. The Zodiac had never promised an ending. He had never suggested that understanding would follow. The expectation of closure existed only outside the record, imposed by those who encountered it. The record itself made no such commitment. It documented what occurred and then stopped. In this sense, the case achieved a rare kind of stability. It no longer shifted with attention. It no longer reacted to reinterpretation. It did not expand under scrutiny. It did not contract under doubts. It remained intact, preserved by its own limits. Those limits were not hidden. They were visible. Clear. The evidence began and ended in specific places. The gaps were defined. Nothing blurred. Nothing merged. The absence was clean. That cleanliness unsettled more than confusion ever could. The Zodiac's final act was not violence, communication, or evasion. It was restraint. He restrained the narrative itself. By refusing to continue, he denied the system the raw material it needed to resolve him. He left behind a complete outline with no center, a form without substance. The system responded, as it always does when resolution is denied. It adapted. It preserved. It acknowledged. The case remained open not as a promise, but as an admission that certainty had not arrived and likely never would. The victims remained present in every retelling, not as symbols but as realities. Their lives did not require interpretation. Their absence did not need explanation to be felt. They existed beneath the silence, unaffected by its endurance. As the years continued forward, the case did not fade. It did not intensify. It held its position, a fixed point where action had ceased and understanding had stopped short. It did not ask to be revisited. It did not resist it either. There was no final sentence waiting to complete the story. No closing gesture to signal completion. The narrative did not end. It settled into its final state. A record without conclusion. An interruption without return. And in that state, unchanged and unyielding, the Zodiac case remains. As the record approached its natural limit, the case no longer suggested continuation of any kind. It did not point forward. It did not loop back. It simply held its shape. Everything that could be said without repeating had already been placed into the record. What remained was not missing material, but the absence of need. The Zodiac had entered public life briefly, decisively, and then exited without friction. He did not retreat under pressure. He did not dissolve into error. He did not seek transformation or redemption. He removed himself at the precise moment when removal guaranteed permanence. That decision shaped everything that followed. The silence that came after did not behave like unfinished business. It behaved like an ending without acknowledgement. There was no sense of interruption, no signal that something had been cut short. The communications simply stopped and nothing replaced them. That lack of replacement was consistent with the pattern that came before it. Over time, even the act of maintaining the case became an exercise in restraint, not pursuing closure for its own sake, not inflating significance beyond what could be supported, accepting that the most accurate version of the story was the one that refused to conclude neatly. The Zodiac did not leave behind a legacy in the traditional sense. He left behind a condition, one where action existed without explanation, where harm existed without resolution, where silence existed without decay. That condition remained stable because it was never challenged by new material. The victims' lives remained the only elements untouched by ambiguity. They did not drift into theory. They did not become symbols. They remained individuals whose presence ended abruptly and without reason. That reality did not change with time. It did not soften. It did not require interpretation. The system that responded to the crimes reached its limit honestly. It documented what could be documented. It pursued what could be pursued. And when nothing else arrived, it stopped moving forward without pretending otherwise. The case stayed open not as a promise, but as an acknowledgement. There was no final revelation waiting beyond the silence. No delayed confession. No overlooked proof poised to emerge. The record had been exhausted without being resolved. That exhaustion was not failure. It was fact. The Zodiac did not vanish into mystery. He ended his participation. That end was clean, complete, unrevised, and because it was never interrupted, it remained intact. Nothing followed. No clarification. No correction. No return. The story did not conclude. It did not unravel. It did not transform. It reached a point where nothing more could be added without distortion. And there it stopped. This is the end of the story.